Dana says he's never going to allow women into the UFC to fight, but then Dana changes his mind, and he changes his mind because of you, effectively. So in September 2012, I remember it very fondly. I remember where I was when I watched the first woman fight in the UFC. Dana says that he's signing the first ever woman fighter in the UFC, a lady called Ronda Rousey, despite saying a year earlier that he wouldn't, but he called you a game changer. And so you did end up changing the game. And you became UFC champion between 2012 and 2015. You won 15 fights back to back. Most of them finished within seconds. And you stacked up a bunch of records, including the fastest ever win, fastest submission, fastest title defense turnaround. And you were voted the best female athlete of all time in a 2015 ESPN fan poll. And Fox Sports called you one of the defining athletes of the 21st century. Part of that sort of 15 fights back to back was, you know, when I think about that period, is the amount of times you were fighting was really unusual. You were fighting, I think there were sometimes you were fighting 3 times in 9 months, which is kind of unheard of for anyone in the UFC. I mean, there's fighters today that seem to just fight once a year. Why were you doing that? Why were you fighting so frequently?
I was fighting that frequently because that's how often Dana called. And I told him that, you know, if you sign me, I will be there to fight whenever you need me. And I never said no. And so anytime that I got an offer, or anytime one of the guys got hurt or fell out, I was always the one that would fill in. And, you know, if there was like I always fought on like February's and August's and November's, like the worst times of the years to fight, because that's when they needed somebody to come in and pick up the numbers. So I wasn't somebody like holding out to only fight on the 4th of July card or New Year's card, which are the best, you know, the highest viewed of the year. I would do whatever was best for the company, because that's what I promised, the role that I would fulfill. That was like the deal that I made when I came in. And, you know, nobody else has to do that. But I felt like I owed it to Dana. I promised him I would be there anytime that he needed me, and I was.
If you could go back and give yourself advice on that day when you signed your UFC contract now, if you could time travel back to that Ronda and give her a little bit of advice, whisper in her ear, what would you say?
I wouldn't change anything.
You wouldn't change anything?
Time travel's not possible. And I led myself to where I am now, and I'm happy with where I'm at. So I wouldn't fuck with it.
When you got the news that you were going to be signing for the UFC as the first ever woman to fight in the UFC, how did that feel?
Validating.
Really?
Yeah, and I was just really excited. I just felt like I was in on a secret that the whole world didn't know. And they were just starting to find out.
And throughout that period, while you're the UFC champion, you take up acting, and you feature in a couple of films like The Fast and Furious, The Expendables, etc. Was that something that you always had planned, or is that something that just arose as an opportunity?
The movie stuff just kind of arose as an opportunity. But, you know, once it became a possibility, I was like, of course I could be the next Bruce Lee, you know? Of course I could do great at this. And I felt like I was a good, like, performer and, you know, great physical performer as well. And I could combine the two in a way that nobody else could. So I went after it with the same kind of confidence I went after everything.
On the 14th of November 2015, you had UFC 193, where you were lined up to fight Holly Holmes in Melbourne, Australia. I remember where I was when that fight happened. I didn't miss many UFC fights, and I still don't miss many, but it was a really sort of a huge turning point for a number of reasons. You were indestructible, basically. That's how the whole UFC community and I think the fan base saw you. But in that moment, as you said earlier on, there was an initial contact, and I watched the clip again earlier on. There's an initial contact. I think it was with Holly Holmes' elbow, if I remember correctly. And then you talked about having this sort of issue with depth perception because of that initial contact, and that's actually what I see in that clip. I see from that first sort of strike that there is an issue with kind of understanding where Holly is, and that fight ends in a head kick. From that moment when you leave the octagon, how does your life and perception of everything change? Because it's interesting, the way that you were built up to that. You were, I was going to say, the top of the mountain. You're up in the clouds at that point. Like it was framed to everyone that you were fundamentally indestructible. You know, and that's kind of what the marketing machine does. It does to everyone they're fundamentally indestructible, but everyone, from Muhammad Ali to my friend Israel in the UFC, everyone has their day where we find out that everyone is a human being to some degree. From the moment you leave the UFC, what is life like from that point onwards when you get back into the medical room?
Extremely depressing. That was my whole identity. It was being champion and undefeated, and it's just like soul crushing. It really was. I was just kind of like forced to face music before I was ready to, and I knew that it was going to catch up to me at some point, but I was more, I think, upset that there were so many people out there that were like reveling in it. And I don't know, it just felt so like unjust in a way, because I just felt like it was just, there's so much of it just wasn't my fault, I just couldn't, like, my brain just couldn't take what I asked of it anymore. And my body took as much as it could until it literally broke. And I gave everybody everything that I had. And that wasn't enough for them. They hated me for not having more. So, I mean, it was tough. It was, I saw a whole bunch of people that I thought were friends just, turn on me. And it was really eye-opening in a way, though, to who true friends are, and what true happiness is, and that outward validation wasn't it. And so I think maybe he might have saved me in a way from going down the path of trying to like chase that high of everybody's, approval forever. But so I guess it was liberating in a way in the long run.
If I was a fly on the wall that night when you left that octagon, what would I have seen?
A lot of crying. I had to get my lip sewed up, the muscle underneath, and then the skin. I remember I was so out of it that I like bit off a chunk of my lip and spit it out like it was like a piece of chapped, like, like a chapped lip. Like, that's how out of it I was. I was biting and chewing, like spitting out chunks of like the flesh in my lip. And people judging me for the decisions I was making while in that state, I think, is what bothered me the most. It wasn't so much that I lost. It was just that people thought that I didn't know how to fight. And, if I was at my full capacity, I don't think anyone could ever beat me. But I just, I was spent. I was running on fumes for so long that I didn't have any fumes left. And the moment that I ran out of fumes was, broadcast live to billions of people everywhere who all had their own assumptions about it, and none of them are right. And I felt like I couldn't speak up or say anything. And honestly, like, whoever I tried to talk to, they didn't care about helping me communicate what I was trying to communicate. They just cared about getting as many clicks as possible, so I couldn't trust anyone to speak through. So I feel like this book was the only way that I could really communicate everything that I'd been holding on to for years. Because, it was really tough, but I literally fought until I couldn't fight anymore. And maybe that's not enough for a lot of people, but I feel like I created the most efficient fighting style that ever created, that's ever existed. And I had to realize that only people that are truly great can recognize greatness. I wanted to be so great that even an idiot couldn't deny it. But then I realized after going into pro wrestling that retiring undefeated and taking the equity that I had with me wouldn't have been what was best for the sport. Even though I know that I'm better than all these girls and by a fucking long shot, and I always will be. Taking my equity away from me so that everybody knows that would actually tarnish my legacy. It wouldn't make everybody take the women after me seriously. And so it had to happen for the betterment of the sport. But, sometimes it still stings a little bit that it's, I'm not recognized as the greatest ever when I know I am. But my mom said all the time, really quick, you have this picture here, that she didn't care if everybody knew she was the best in the world. She only cared if she knew. She didn't care that nobody knew who was the first American world champion of judo back in 1984. It was important to her. And I think like somewhere along the way, it started to matter more what other people thought than what I thought. And so I think being forced back to that was actually the best thing that could have happened to me.
I don't think people realize the extent of, they see it as kind of just a game. Fighting, they see it as some kind of game that they're watching, like they're playing on the Xbox or PlayStation. But I don't think they understand the extent of the devastation on a human level that you kind of experience after that loss. And I think until you did that interview with Ellen, where you revealed that you'd gone back to your changing room and you had this sort of suicidal ideation about the future, most people didn't realize the extent of it until then. Did you literally have suicidal ideation in the days and hours following the fight?
No, it was basically like instantly when I came backstage. But, suicide is the kind of thing that becomes more prevalent if, it's in your family. And I've literally had 2 generations of suicide ahead of me. It's just something that it's always an option in your mind once it's shown to you, But I think that the fact that I was with Trav then, my husband now, that I just didn't want to take the pain that I had in me and give it to him, because that's how I experienced suicide was okay, you get to relieve yourself of that pain, but you pass it on to everybody else. And but my dad was dying anyway. He wouldn't have been able to prevent his death, and he was physically suffering every day, and so I understand that. And I didn't feel like I had the same kind of justification that I wasn't going to die anyway. So I was gonna live for him and for my family, so that they wouldn't have to take the pain that I was feeling onto them.
Was that the hardest moment in your professional career?
Professionally, yeah.
Was it the hardest moment in your personal life?
No, losing my dad was worse.
You went on to fight Amanda Nunes at UFC 207 in 2016, and the fight ends again. And after this, you come to the decision that your time at the UFC is over, and you decide to move on to the WWE. There's a sort of a 2-year gap, I believe, about a 1-year gap between the Nunes fight and the WWE announcement. What happens in your life in that gap?
I was mostly just being sad. I was just sad and high and playing video games and eating crepes. I mean, everybody wants to rush you through grieving things, but, I think it's important. And so I took that time to myself. I was also just so worn out from, like I said, running on fumes for years on end, and literally dragging myself out of bed every morning and having to dig deep every second of the day. That I just, wanted to dig deep and just disappear. I had, paparazzi and all kinds of crazy shit happening at the time. And I just didn't want to be famous anymore. So it was always more of a tool than a goal. And now that I didn't have fights to promote, I didn't need it anymore. But I guess it wasn't done with me. So I kind of had to disappear for a while to be left alone.
Were you doing anything professionally during that period? Or were you just at home?
I was just at home. I feel like I just needed to not give anymore. I don't think anyone can understand how exhausted I was and how much it had been asked of me for so long, that I just needed to rest. I needed to mentally and physically rest. And, but people that have, dug deep enough to make it to 2 Olympics and win 15 fights in a row. You know, not a lot of people understand how much effort that takes. And just sounds like numbers when you say it, but when you live it, it's just like, I literally had nothing left in me. I like, could barely get out of bed. So, I mean, it's not the kind of like tired that you can take a long sleep from and wake up refreshed, you know? Like, it's like the kind of tired that takes like a year to recover from.
Is that depression in your mind?
Yes, so you could call it depression. But you know, I didn't see anyone and get diagnosed.